Good morning, everyone. My name's Margot Prouse, and I'm a member of the League of Women Voters of San Joaquin County. Welcome to all of you attending this first in a series of forums on climate change and what's next, looking at our local area. As we share these forums and hope to seek ways of dealing with the effects of climate change, I want to stress the importance of talking about climate change more frequently. It's just something we don't do very often. We tend to make it our focus in a time of catastrophes like the forest fires and the floods and horrific tornadoes, but when it's really blatantly in front of us so that we can't avoid it. But everything we do every day is leading to these catastrophes, and we need to seek change. So please, let's start talking about climate change. I'm going to highlight some of our technical issues this morning. This meeting is being recorded, and we plan to have a link to access it on our website. All attendees will be muted when they enter and will remain muted throughout the presentations. Any questions you have should be submitted per chat. And then following the second presentation, as many questions as we have time for will be read and answered. Now I'd like to introduce Gretchen Newby, President of our League of Women Voters of San Joaquin County, who will share a few words about our local league.
Hi, well, thank you everybody for being here and taking time out of your weekend. Very much appreciated, and it's certainly an indication that you have concerns about the future moving forward. We are somewhat overwhelmed at this time. At this point in time, we have threats not only to our climate, but also to our democracy, threats to our health and safety, our very well-being. And this is having a serious effect on all of us in terms of how we feel about the world, how we feel about ourselves, and how we feel about how we have feelings sometimes of helplessness and not being able to make an impact on what's happening. A league is one of those ways that we can have an impact, that we can be a participant rather than an observer, where people can be part of the solution. And I'm reminded of a phrase that I heard a long time ago, and I took very seriously. It's that if you're not part of the solution, you may be part of the problem. So the time is right to act through League and through other means to speak out on behalf of things like climate change and what's happening to us in our local community and in the world, and to pay attention and to find opportunities to speak, to be present, to be well informed, to perhaps even be a part of the solution moment by moment and opportunity by opportunity. Last year in June, the board recommended that climate change be one of the concerns, one of the areas of focus for League, for our local league here in San Joaquin County. And we took a poll of the members, and the members voted or affirmed that that would be a focus for this year, among other areas as well. So here we are moving forward, and again, taking advantage of at least one opportunity, an important one, to become better informed and to find ways to be part of that solution. There are things that are happening every day with regards to climate. Certainly there are some movies being made about it and taking advantage through the entertainment industry. But just to share a little bit, I live in Midtown Stockton in a 100-year-old neighborhood, and I have to drive 9 blocks every day through Midtown to get to where I work. And every single day, I am in awe of the beautiful urban forests that we live in here. And when the first settlers came to Stockton, and I'm a history buff, so I have interesting documentation about this. When they first came from the Midwest, they wanted to feel familiar and at home, and they wanted to reconstruct the urban forest that they had come from. And so they planted trees. They planted a lot of non-native trees, the ones they were familiar with back east. They created forests in our parks. And year by year, and now day by day, we're seeing those forests die. They're not only dying from drought, but they're also falling down. And in even a light rainfall, when I go to work in the morning and I come home, I am reminded because there are trees down. They're across the street, they're on houses, big branches that have been there for over 120 years are falling down. If that's not a wake-up call and a reminder that we need to pay attention, I don't know what is. I'm a very cautious person. I told my kids that if we are being warned about a flood, and I live between Smith Canal and the San Joaquin River and very close to the port, I can hear the ships. And I tell them, if there's a flood or if there's a fire in our urban, suburban area, I'm going to be the first one out of town. So don't worry about me. I'll be okay. But I worry about other people that can't get out of town, that don't have anywhere to go, that may not have transportation, who stay because they can't take their pets with them. And this is a very real crisis. So thank you again for being here, being a participant, and paying attention and for caring.
Thank you, Gretchen. Moving on. So our first speaker, Patricia McEwen, is an anthropologist doing research into genocide. Her first degree from Long Beach State was in marine biology. As a research assistant at the Institute of Marine and Coastal Studies at USC, she worked on BLM surveys of proposed offshore oil drilling sites and studies of oil and thermal pollution. Returning to Stockton, she became a forensic tech for the police department, then for the International Criminal Tribunal in Yugoslavia. That led to graduate school at Sac State and an MA in anthropology. She's also a published writer of science fiction, fantasy, horror, and mystery, with 2 novels out. Shorter pieces have appeared in magazines and anthologies, including one about climate change, Welcome to the Greenhouse. Today, she's speaking on climate change, a case of extremes as well as averages. Her presentation will discuss the far-reaching changes that are occurring globally and how those changes are being felt more rapidly in California. What those physical changes are that have been exacerbated since the start of the Industrial Revolution, and the cycles of extreme disasters that are deadly, costly, and becoming more frequent. Please welcome with me, Patricia McEwen.
Good morning. Okay. And my purpose this morning is to explain what's going on with climate change, as in what is causing all of this. There has been a lot of argument and disinformation about it. So I'm just going to give you a primer. If I'm too simple, please forgive me, but there are a lot of people who are not science trained and have heard so much misinformation that it's all very confusing. So we'll start with some basics, and then we'll proceed to exactly what's going on here in California, because we've all seen that firsthand. The basic force involved here is something called the greenhouse effect. This is a natural process. This is something that we depend on to keep us warm enough not to have the oceans frozen over. It's something that we would miss if it wasn't here. What happens is that sunlight comes in from the sun, and then our planet reflects about 30% of it normally back out into space. The greenhouse effect is caused by various gases in the atmosphere. The chief among them is water vapor. Another natural source is carbon dioxide, and then there's methane. All of these are perfectly normal to have in the atmosphere. They're here because we are here and life is here. But we've been changing the mix on those gases, and that is changing how much of the heat goes back out into space. It's cutting it down. And it's cutting it down to a level that is becoming seriously a problem. This isn't really the best title, the worst greenhouse gases, because as I said, the first three are perfectly normal. We have water vapor in the atmosphere because we are a water world. We can't live without that water. But as the Earth warms up, more of that water evaporates into the atmosphere. And that acts as a greenhouse enhancer, and so we have more warming. This is a feedback loop. The second one is carbon dioxide. That's the one that plants breathe in and we breathe out. Also a necessity. We don't even know to take another breath unless we have some carbon dioxide to tell our lungs that we need it. Right now, however, we are pumping lots and lots and lots of extra carbon dioxide into the air. The fossil fuels are probably the major source of added gas. They're not the only ones. There are other feedback loops that come into that because as we progress with the warming, we are doing things like thawing the tundra in the permafrost. We're melting ice. We're releasing things that have been stored in sea bottom deposits of things like methane clathrates. Now, methane is one you're going to hear a lot more about shortly because it's growing rapidly of late. It is 28 times stronger than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. And we're told not to worry about it so much because it's only in the air for about 5 years. But now we know that after 5 years, what it does is turn into carbon dioxide. So then we have it for another 20 years. Some of these others are the results of industrial processes that are not part of the fossil fuel problem. They're manufacturing products. The most serious is nitrous oxide, which is, laughing gas, what you use at the dentist to get you calmed down because fillings are stressful. It's also found in auto exhaust. And the problem with it is that even if it lowers the levels are lower, it's 298 times stronger than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. Then we have ozone. You've probably heard a good deal about that because of the ozone holes at the poles. In the upper atmosphere, ozone shields us from extra UV radiation from the sun. That's the stuff that gives you sunburns. But at the ground level, it helps warm things up too. Next, we have trifluoromethane. This is a fire suppressant. It's used to make computer chips. It's 11,700 times stronger than carbon dioxide, which is pretty daunting. Then we have hexafluoroethane. This is also used to make computer chips. It's 9,200 times stronger, and it lasts in the atmosphere for thousands of years. The same for sulfur hexafluoride, which is an insulator in electronics. It's 22,000 times stronger than carbon dioxide, and it lasts much longer. So this is to give you a quick look at what's been happening over the course of the last 800,000 years. You can see that things have gradually been going up with carbon dioxide. This is the natural cycle for the most part. But then when we start getting into the Industrial Revolution, and that last peak starts up, you'll see on the right where it just goes straight up to currently about twice the historic level. And this is a similar map of the methane levels. You'll see this one ends at 2004, and I can tell you that that peak is even higher now at the far right. This is what we've been calling the hockey stick. So why does that matter? If I show you this map of global temperatures that have been slowly rising, you will look at the left and say, 0.2 degrees, really? Does that matter? But this is 0.2 degrees, 0.4 degrees, 0.6 degrees as an average for the entire planet. And while we may be a small blue marble in the sky from the moon or from Jupiter, right here and now, it's a big place. So that average is a global temperature as if we were using a thermometer on the entire world at once. And the problem is that we have seen it continue to rise like this. In fact, each of the last 4 decades has been the hottest on record. There's a lot of effects that are going on because of this at the moment. We are seeing the reduction of the ice packs at the poles. You can now actually take the Northwest Passage to go from the Pacific to the Atlantic and back again. We're even seeing whales use it. We are seeing massive ice loss from the ice sheets, especially on Greenland and Antarctica now. But what really affects us are things like the jet stream here in California, and then this natural cycle that I'm going to talk about. This is a map of what the normal status is across the Pacific Ocean, which is the basis of that cycle. As you can see, the strong trade winds generally blow to the west, and there are strong equatorial currents in the sea that go with them. And the result is that we end up pushing a lot of warmed up seawater through tropical waters, and then it piles up against the Philippines and the other areas in Southeast Asia. Now that is creating an extra heat level that wouldn't be there without the trade winds. And at some point, when we keep raising the temperature, that is a budget that has to be balanced. This is the map that we had on the opening slide. This is a map of the ENSO. We know it better by the names El Nino and La Nina. The El Nino Southern Oscillation is a pattern where the heat budget across the Pacific Ocean has to be balanced. We have a balance, each of us in our own households, that we have to balance, or else we're going to wind up in debt and then in serious trouble if we don't keep up with it. In this case, we're not talking about heat, we're talking about money. I'm sorry, I got that reversed. We are talking about heat and not money. What the ENSO cycle does is balance the heat budget all the way across the Pacific Ocean, all the way from the Philippines, and then when it gets to us, we have a set of average years with 2 extremes in the cycle. The one that we know as El Nino is the one that brings us the hot summers, the warm air, and the dryness, the lack of rain. And then when we have the other extreme, La Nina, we have cooler air coming in, and we bring a lot of water in. The problem, of course, is that this is not quite in balance anymore. What we're in right now is a La Nina phase. You may have noticed we've gotten a lot of rain and a lot of snow, which is why I'm talking to you from Oregon, because I couldn't quite make it back across the mountain passes yet after seeing my grandkids. This is just a brief little map here. You can see that during La Nina, we have lots and lots of these cooler areas coming up from the equator instead of the usual heat. So when it comes to us, what we actually get out of all that is our snow. We depend on this snowpack up in the Sierra Nevadas. It's our primary source of water for the entire Central Valley. This particular section is what feeds the river basins for the San Joaquin Valley, and it's called the San Joaquin watershed. You'll see that it includes Mono Lake, Lake Tahoe. Well, the problem with all of this is that in an average year, we have an average snowpack, but when the ENSO cycle is in an extreme state, either El Nino or La Nina, then it changes the snow levels. We've also seen that the ENSO cycle is shortening. When Cortez arrived in Mexico, the 2 extremes came about 20 years apart. But that's been cutting down. By the time of the gold rush, 1850 or so, the cycle had shortened to about 12 years. By 1965, when I was in high school, in Lodi, it had shortened to about 7 years. Then it shortened to 3. And now we have no neutral years in between. So what does this mean for us? We're going straight from El Nino to La Nina and back again. This is a picture of Mount Shasta from last summer, and it's naked. There is no snow cover. I have not heard anything specific about the little glacier up on top of it, but whatever is not covered is probably gone now. And that is ice that has been there for centuries and millennia. And yet, come winter, all of a sudden we had some unstable warmed areas. We have this kind of heat wave phenomenon that seems to be rolling around the top of the world and affecting all of the northern hemisphere. And this big loop in the jet stream is bringing masses of warm air with it. And then behind that comes a cold snap. So the cold snap we had in December brought us the Donner Pass event, where we had 16 feet of snow in a single day. And as far as I know, that's an all-time record. You've heard of it already, I'm sure. It's called the Pineapple Express. What this is a giant rain bomb. It stretches all the way across the Pacific, and all that heat that the trade winds have been pushing to the west starts coming back to the east in the upper layers of the atmosphere. And you'll see a little bunch of dots down toward the bottom of this, above the 160 and 150 west latitude markers on the bottom. That's Hawaii. This is why we call it the Pineapple Express. It's coming from Hawaii, and it's sweeping up all of that tropical moisture, and it's delivering it straight to us, which is why we get these huge rainstorms, and sometimes we get really big events. The biggest one on record happened in 1862, and it flooded the entire lower sections of the Central Valley. We're talking square miles. We're talking Stockton itself, which was flooded heavily in this event. But we've had more recent demonstrations. If you were here in the winter of 1996 and 97, you will remember the one that hit us. This is that storm coming in on the Pineapple Express, bringing all that warm tropical water at the first of the year, which is when we already had a snowpack. And all that warm water dropped as rain on top of that snow and melted a great deal of it all at once. And of course, we're downstream from all of that. So the effects around here and in some places up in the mountains included flooded roads, flooded parking lots, levee breaks, flooded neighborhoods. We have mudslides in some areas. I was working for the police department then. We had to patrol neighborhoods and evacuate people, and then stand watch on the levees, watching for boils, because that might mean another levee break. You may recall that we also had to use the I-5 freeway itself in its elevated sections as a dike down toward Modesto and Manteca. We actually had bulldozers who were pushing dirt on the underpasses in order to create a solid leveling in an area where our own levees had already broken. So this is not fun. This is what we've already been hit with this year too. This is how we got those 16 feet. We can hope and pray that 1862 isn't coming our way again, but we can't know whether it is or not. The odds that it will are improving. And there are people who think that, we're getting these rain bombs, that makes up for the drought. We're getting more snowpack out of it. But because we don't have the average years in between anymore, we have this flip-flop, and it doesn't give our entire system enough time to recharge, enough rain, enough snow. So overall, we have annual rainfall, snowpack levels, and groundwater levels all falling. During last summer's drought, I have a map here on the right-hand side that shows the wells that many farmers and many towns are using for their water supply. During last summer's drought, thousands of these wells went dry. We had whole towns reduced to trucking in water for the bare basics. That's 1 out of every 5 wells. So water stress is building. What do we mean by water stress? Basically, it means that you're using more than 25% of your renewable water supply. When we pull water out of wells, it has to come from the aquifer. The aquifer is fed by water filtering down from the surface when we have rainstorms and when we have extra flooding sometimes. But that aquifer is very old. It's thousands of years old. And we're pulling a little too much water out of it. In fact, we're not regulating what we're pulling out at all. We don't have a good system for measuring even how much we are taking. But you can see from this map that the United States as a whole is one of the countries expected to face some pretty high water stress by 2040, which is not that far away anymore. If you get up to the 80% level or more, water stress is considered extreme. And there are a great many people who believe that the Arab Spring phenomenon, when we had a great deal of political unrest in the Middle East, and wars and revolutions breaking out, and then refugees, was basically because they were under water stress from a drought, and that was pushing up the price of food. And these are basically started all with bread riots. Where it's happening the worst in the United States is in the West. This is an overall map, and you can see that the West as a whole is suffering problems. It's especially noticeable in the Southwest, which is mostly desert to start with, but now it's getting really dry. Up through the middle of the country, we see patches of it, but this area on the left includes a lot of our forest lands and the Rocky Mountains. And this is a map of the recent drought in California over the last 3 or 4 years. As you can see, it was eventually everywhere. No part of California escaped it. Drought like this is something we can expect to keep coming back. The ENSO cycle will bring it to us, whatever we do. And it will be made worse because gradually the snowpack is predicted to drop to 15% of what we call normal by the end of the century. So this is going to take some serious planning and some serious remedies. Just what happened last year led to a lot of water reductions in the irrigation water supplied to farmers. As you can see, there's that light green area in the center there to the east of San Francisco. That's us. We did not get hit nearly as hard as many other areas. Basically, the Delta was our friend there. We had enough of our own water and could hang on to it that we weren't hit with a lot of these reductions along the California aqueduct. The southern part of the valley was hit very hard indeed. We had tens of thousands of acres that were left fallow last year. And in some cases, that meant that what was planted there died, especially in the orchards and some vineyards. And then, of course, up around Sacramento, where we have the Yellow Causeway, and you can see the rice paddies come running right up to the I-5 highway. No one grew any rice last year. There wasn't enough water to do it. It's one of our major crops. And if you think this may be a local problem, I would remind you that California produces 25% of the nation's produce, 1/4 out of 50 states. We matter. We've been told that we're just a little agricultural county, but all of these agricultural counties are feeding our country. Another problem, of course, is what comes with drought. Heat waves. We are seeing new records set all the time now. Just last summer, we saw the worst in Furnace Creek in Death Valley, which has always been our hottest spot in California. It's in the middle of the desert. It's in a bowl that is lower than sea level. It helps concentrate all that heat and reflect it back into the same place. Even so, it has never hit 130 degrees Fahrenheit before, and it did it twice. And if you are interested in looking at more of the global effects of these heat waves, I would highly recommend Scott Duncan's links. He's a meteorologist based in Scotland who likes to look at the global effects and watch those heat waves traveling around the world, followed by the cold snaps, and then looking at storm systems. It was not entirely that deadly up here, but in Southern California as a whole, these are the kind of temperatures we were seeing in August. The first serious heat wave we got was in July, and then a month later we started getting another one. So it was 116 degrees in large parts of Southern California. But you may ask yourself, how serious are heat waves? And unfortunately, the bad news is they can get really bad. You may remember in 2003, we had this huge heat wave in Europe, and France had a number of problems with it because they did not have air conditioning, and they had a lot of senior citizens who were in facilities that had no cooling facilities to speak of. But the rest of Europe had problems with it too. I don't know if you're aware of this, but a grand total of 70,000 people died in that one. In 2010, we had one in Russia that we still don't have the facts on because they don't like to share their problems. But we believe they lost anywhere from 10,000 to 50,000 people in another heat wave. It also cost them most of their wheat crop for that entire year, which is pretty serious when you have a country that is half Siberia and you are very dependent on your wheat crop to feed anybody. So back in 2006, we had a heat wave here. You may remember it. For about a week, we had 115 degrees day after day. The Delta breeze failed us. We couldn't get any air movement. It was a little on the sticky side, and humidity always raises the issues, because when it's really humid, you can't sweat and get rid of heat just by using your body's own natural systems. Unfortunately, across this country and in California in particular, we're not very good at counting heat deaths. The official state count for the decade between 2010 and 2019 had the state telling us that we only had 599 deaths to heat exposure. And yeah, I looked at 599 and said, only? That's pretty significant all by itself. But then there are new estimates that say that that event in 2006 alone, with that week of 115 degrees, when people driving down I-5 past the dairies were seeing cows drop dead in the fields. We actually lost 650 people just in 7 counties in the Central Valley, which is more than the state's estimate for the entire decade, yes? So the LA Times had 6 of its reporters take a look at all of this and use a statistical method where they were comparing the number of deaths that increased on the hottest days compared to the normal averages. And they found the death toll was about 6 times higher than the official state tally. The Times estimated extreme heat caused 3,900 deaths over the same period. So this is one of the things we need to work on. This last summer, we did not have a huge number of deaths because we have worked hard on building cooling centers and getting word out to people how to get to them. But we still have some issues because we did lose about 150 people over the last summer. And part of it was that people were afraid to turn on the air conditioning if they had it. The people who died were elderly folks and people too poor to have cars. They didn't have transportation or a way to get to a cooling center, or they were afraid to pay the PG&E bill for turning on that air conditioner. So these are things that we need to consider from a regulatory point of view and from a social services point of view. but I will leave that one to the next speaker. With drought, we also get wildfires, and I have no doubt that you're well aware of that. What you see here are two maps. On the left is the Dixie Fire, which was up around Lake Almanor, and actually beat out the previous winner for biggest, worst fire in California history. Because 2 years ago, we had the Mendocino Complex fire when we had the dry lightning set off all of those fires in the Santa Cruz area. But it's been passed up by this Dixie Fire, which was bigger and worse and burned more. And in fact, we've lost entire towns to this. The one on the right is the Calder Fire, also from this last summer, which almost took out south of Lake Tahoe. This is now the #1 biggest, worst fire in California history. Dixie is #3. The Mendocino Complex is now the third out of the list. And while we have been lucky out here in the flatlands to have nothing but grass fires, this still affects us because it affects our watersheds, it cuts our roads down, and it has burned entire towns. This is Greenville. This is all that's left of the entire town. And you may recall, just 3 years ago, we had the big fire sweep through Paradise, the Camp Fire. And in that case, people didn't get out. A lot of people were burned to death in their cars trying to escape, and we lost a total of 88 lives, as well as nearly the entire town. So the fire season isn't what it used to be. 5 years ago, we had a regular fire season, and then it expanded by 78 days a year. At this point, I don't think we can say that we have a fire season. What we have is fires everywhere. This is a map from last year, and you'll see that what happens to us when all of this happens around us is that we get the smoke from all of it. We get it from every direction. Fires were burning down toward Yosemite. The big fires were up toward the California border with Nevada, but we also had fires ringing the Central Valley. So I'm not sure what the answer is to smoke either, but this is something that strongly affects our health here, and it certainly affects what we're able to do in terms of agriculture too, because this stuff is not good for the crops or for our wildlife or for our domestic animals and our agricultural animals. So what we're doing here is asking people to think about this. It's local people who know local conditions best. You know your town, you know your valley, you know your own experience in living here. So we have to ask ourselves, what can we do here and now to deal with these changes? Because some of them are likely to get much worse. We talked about the shortage of water. Can we do more water conservation? We're already doing many of these things, but we can do more of them. With water conservation, we can do things like laser leveling flatland fields so that they need less water for irrigation. What about levee maintenance when we get these Pineapple Expresses? We're going from one extreme to the other, and the result can be those huge floods that we had in 1996-97. We already know that the levees can break and that when these things happen, some of them will. But what about protecting our groundwater too? No one is accurately measuring exactly how much we're taking out. And when fracking is going on, we are not even keeping track of what's being pumped into the ground that will eventually leak into our groundwater. Some of that is liable to become forever chemicals, and then we won't be able to use it for anything like drinking, cooking. And I mentioned the cooling and heating centers. We need more of them, I think, more spread out across the county. And we have to think about news and communication so that people know about them. But I think we also should look at things like transportation. What about more fire prevention? When what's burned in the mountains is done burning, there will still be things down here in the valley that can burn. And you may remember that one little fire that started in high winds just off of I-5 and burned down 130 residential units just off the Ben Holt intersection. That could be coming back too. But there are many more things than this that we might do. What do you think? It's time to start telling yourself, it's time. We can't put this off. This is not going to happen 100 years from now. It is already happening right now. Many of things that we've talked about are happening faster than even the IPCC, the International Program on Climate Change, has predicted. After all, they said that we weren't going to be able to use the Northwest Passage. It wouldn't open until 2035. And we've already got cruise ships using it, not to mention freighters. So I will pass this back to the hosts of the program and hope that this spurs some questions.
Thank you so much, Patricia. And Patricia will have an attachment. We'll attach it to our recording with further resources that can highlight what she's been discussing. So you'll have an opportunity to look at them yourself. As Director of Emergency Operations, Shelley Lima is responsible for the direction and management of the administrative and operational emergency activities of the Office of Emergency Services for San Joaquin County. In this capacity, Ms. Lima coordinates planning, preparedness, and oversight of the County Emergency Operations Center. OES supports and coordinates the efforts of the county departments carrying out their functions in the field. Ms. Lima is an Air Force veteran, holds a master's degree in business administration from the University of the Pacific. She's a FEMA certified all hazards logistics section chief and all hazards public information officer. She holds a certification in advanced critical incident stress management. Her presentation today will be Preparing to be Prepared, Risks and Vulnerabilities. She will provide an overview of how the San Joaquin County Office of Emergency Services conducts planning for disasters, explore some of the risks and vulnerabilities we face in this county, and things we might be able to do to prepare. Last, we will look at some things that you can do to be better prepared for disaster. Please welcome with me, Shelley Lima. I'm gonna start my share. Hi, Shelley.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, great. Okay. Then that takes care of the first part that I had trouble with this morning. So thank you for this opportunity. I appreciate it. How would you like me to do the screen share piece?
Perfect.
Right on. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you again. I'm very excited to be able to share this information. The last presentation really kind of was a perfect introduction to some of the things that I'd like to talk about. So you have a really good idea of kind of what goes on around us and in our community. Again, my name is Shelley Lima. I'm the Emergency Operations Director for San Joaquin County. I've been in this role since 2018. Historically, I was in the military and worked my way up to this position. I've been a 911 dispatcher for San Joaquin County. I was the regional medical and health coordinator for an 11 county region, which is one of the counties that San Joaquin County lies in, to the state. So I have a varied background in all of this emergency management stuff. Our office has a staff of 6. So it's very small, and I have 1 vacancy right now. So we're hoping to hire someone in the very near future. OES is a key disaster preparedness office for San Joaquin County. We have direct responsibility to support and coordinate the efforts of county departments that carry out their emergency functions in the field. This includes operation of the County Emergency Operations Center. We also provide disaster information, logistical support, and we coordinate mutual aid requests, both into and out of the county. We facilitate coordination with agencies within the county, such as all of the 7 cities, over 120 special districts. And this includes our local maintaining agencies, water districts, utility districts, various things like that, locally based state and federal agencies, specifically for disasters and emergency events. We also review other agencies' emergency plans, and we provide recommendations for improvement for their plans as well. And we make sure that their plans are consistent with our own county plan. We coordinate several federal and state grants. Right now we have 8 grants that we are coordinating to the tune of about 8 or 9 million, I believe we're at right now. And those are multi-year grants. And that doesn't include the recovery operations for the COVID pandemic. So far, our public assistance grant for that looks to be about $8 million that the county has spent out of pocket for the recovery efforts. Our Emergency Operations Center remains activated. This is the longest activation that our EOC has had historically. It's been over 1.5 years now. That is both for COVID and the drought operations. So we're kind of running a couple of different avenues there. We're currently assisting public health in bringing in more opportunities for testing. And I believe this week you're going to start to see a huge influx of those opportunities. So I'm going to be talking a little bit more about how San Joaquin County Office prepares for disasters and how you can better be prepared for all hazards. So I'd like to start off with a quiz. These are always fun. Just keep notes to yourself. It's relatively easy. For each statement or question that I ask, give yourself a point if you can answer yes. Some of the questions will have bonus points available. So here we go. So when I, and I'm, whoops, wrong button. I have 2 mouses that I'm using, so hopefully this won't happen very often. And when you're preparing to travel or to drive to an unfamiliar place, you look at a map, carefully select your route, or ask someone else to give you some suggestions about 24 hours in advance of your trip. Give yourself a point if you can answer yes to that question. The next question. You have an emergency phone contact list of phone numbers saved in more than one place, such as an address book, on the refrigerator, in a notebook, and not just on a digital format like a phone or a computer. Number 3, I have an old-fashioned telephone. It does not require an electrical cord, and a landline in my home. All of that counts as 1 point. Number 4, I've practiced evacuating my house in case of a fire or other emergency, and everyone in the family has participated at least once in the last year. Number 5, I always make sure that there's at least a 1/4 tank of gas in my car in case of an emergency evacuation order. Number 6, and this one is worth 2 points. I have a first aid kit. Give yourself a point if you have one in your home, and another point if you have one in a vehicle. Number 7, I have an emergency kit prepared in my home. Give yourself an extra point for each of the following if you have it. It has cash, extra water, a flashlight with extra batteries, a solar battery charger backup, like for a cell phone, and some sort of power generator. All right. Number 8, I know exactly where to find my important papers like insurance policies, copies of birth or death certificates. Give yourself a bonus point if you have a copy of these items stored in a location outside of your home in case of a fire. This will be like a safe deposit box or in the cloud. Number 9, I have made emergency plans for my pets, and I even have an emergency supply of pet food in my emergency kit. If you don't have a pet, you don't get a point for this, but we'll make up for it in the end, so it'll be okay. The next question, if an emergency happened and all of my family members were away from the home, maybe work or school or shopping, they all know exactly how to connect with each other to make sure we are all okay, even if phone communications are down. In other words, I have a communications plan that we've shared with the family. And the last question, if there were a power outage that lasted for more than 3 days, I have plans already in place to take care of my family and pets in my home. I'm not worried. All right. So now count up your points, see how many you have. If you have more than 15 points, give yourself a pat on the back. You are relatively well prepared. You've been thinking about things, and you should be very proud of yourself. If you have less than 10 points, I'm going to encourage you to start thinking about how you can improve that score. While there's no way to prevent a disaster, being prepared to weather the storm will improve your stress level when it happens to you. Towards the end of my presentation, I'll share some tips to help you attain a higher score. So hopefully you all did really well on that. But let's take a look at how some other Americans, what they believe may be personally impacted by a disaster in the next 3 to 5 years. 61% in this particular study that was done last year across the country believe that they will be personally impacted by a natural disaster. 73% have taken at least one step to prepare for that disaster. So in this study, they report that 35% of Americans have some disaster supplies on hand. 32% have an evacuation plan, in other words, to get out of their town or neighborhood. They've backed up and stored medical or financial records. And that's all about in the low 30s. Only 26% have taken inventory of their assets or their possessions for insurance purposes. 24% have an emergency savings account. 15% have created a disaster plan to protect their finances. And of all of this, the one that's most scary for emergency managers is the fact that at least 25% of Americans have not taken any steps at all to prepare for a disaster. Now that could be because they can't afford to in many cases, but we like to encourage people to take as many steps as possible. And I'm going to point out some things that we can do towards the end, whether for all income levels. So thanks for indulging me with that piece. We'll go back to that. So I want to kind of detour us and talk about how my office evaluates what's going on in the community and the world and our county to prepare and set up plans and develop how we're going to operate. And also we use this information to determine gaps that we need to make extra plans for. So that's where our grant money comes in. We estimate how much something could cost if we have that particular disaster. So we use that to leverage how much money we're going to spend on making that piece better and improving that response effort that we would have in the event of that emergency. So let's look at some of the threats and hazards that affect San Joaquin County. This really isn't in order of anything in particular. It's kind of alphabetical. And this was taken directly from our county's hazard mitigation plan, as well as our county emergency operations plan that was just renewed this month, as a matter of fact. So these are all things that could affect our county, and these could cause severe economic. Some of these can cause life loss, and it could cause so many problems to our future. And it oftentimes takes 10, 20 years to recover from these kinds of emergencies. I know our last speaker spoke a lot about some of these natural causes, because that's where we're looking at climate change and how that can affect us. There's also technological, cybersecurity, human caused. These are things that 10 years ago we really didn't think much about, but now that our dams and utilities and the power grid are off of cyber and working on they're all computerized and IT, there is more of a chance where foreign terrorists can integrate into those systems and cause mass problems. So they would stop our dams from being able to release water if we had a lot of runoff. They could cause our utilities to shut off and not allow them to restart. And if that happens, it can take days for them to bring those utility systems back up and get them back online, which causes more problems down the road. And this is where I was talking to, I had mentioned earlier that we plan on all hazards. So we look at these threats and we think about, what is the likelihood of this threat affecting our community? We bring in a group of subject matter experts into a room, and we also work with the public and hold public meetings. In fact, I'll tell you now, our local hazard mitigation plan is being renewed over the next 18 months. So we will be holding public meetings to bring people into that room and make sure that we aren't missing any of these vulnerabilities and the likelihood or the threat that they could bring to our community. So we'll look at things that are specific. If that disaster happened at noon versus midnight, in my business, we always say this disaster is going to happen on Sunday morning at 3 o'clock in the morning, because that's when everybody's at home or they're not really paying attention. They've probably logged off from any kind of social media or way to get emergency notifications. So if this emergency happened in North County versus South County, or in the Delta versus in the Linden, maybe north of Linden in the fields there, it has an entirely different outcome. There's a different number of people that live there, so the populations would be entirely different. There's social and physical vulnerabilities of the community, and some pockets of our county have populations that don't have the ability to evacuate quickly. Maybe they don't have a car. Maybe they don't have that. Maybe they live in a nursing home, so they rely on other people to help them evacuate. So we bring all these key factors and create algorithms to try to determine what the most critical emergencies and parts of the emergency, if we were affected, we need to be most prepared for. So an example of this at the bottom of the screen there, if we had an industrial accident in a chemical plant, let's say one that was in the port of Stockton, they have a number of chemical facilities there. If something there were to happen, which way the wind is blowing makes a huge difference on how we are going to respond to that incident, how many people are involved, if the wind is blowing hard, or if it's not blowing at all, if we're having one of those hot days where the wind just is heavy and everything sits on the ground, that's going to change everything. So we look at all these different aspects. So that's why we call it the all hazards planning piece. So different threats, depending on the threat. So I just listed 3 that are pretty basic that most people have an idea of what could happen. FEMA has broken this down by capability. There's 32 core capabilities that FEMA has identified. So that's what the language here is kind of overreaching, but it's very consistent across the country. And this is how we try to do things. So that way, when I call for something, the terminology is the same across the country. So that's where these terms come from. But if we have an earthquake, earthquakes will affect our ability to coordinate operationally. Maybe some radio towers for our fire departments will go down, our law enforcement towers. Risk management, getting information out to people. Critical transportation, bus routes could be damaged because roadways are damaged. We may not be able to get aircraft in or out, so that could affect our supply chain. Fatality management, depending on how horrible the earthquake is, that's affected. So that's kind of what you see, these different core capabilities. So they cross over depending on the emergency. So we could, depending on how bad the flood is, we could have fatality management or mass care services issues. So under the flood side, we're going to have some logistics and supply management issues, trying to get into and out of some of those areas that were flooded. Maybe people are put on an island where they're safe on the island, but now we have to see about getting them things to take care of them for an extended amount of time, or getting them out of that area. Our economic recovery, I mean, many of these overlap. I ran out of space at the bottom there. So that economic recovery should be of both the earthquake and flood. Active shooter is another one that impacts our capabilities and the ability to help people. Depending on how long that lasts, that could have to overlap into maybe mass care services. Maybe we have to evacuate a school or an apartment complex for a long period of time while they continue the standoff. So there are things that interact and interconnect depending on the type of emergency. After going through this 5 years ago, because we redo our hazard mitigation plan every 5 years. So 5 years ago, when we reviewed everything, flooding and levee break was our #1 threat. Drought was #2. We had severe thunderstorms and rain, excessive heat, climate change were all listed as other high priority and high risk for our county. So we have, most of our plans are centered around the needs with that type of an emergency. Energy shortage, train derailment, civil disturbances, and pandemic were among the other pretty high noted areas. Unfortunately, many of those have come to fruition, and we are actively working on them now. So hopefully that makes sense for you. Our assessments lead to objective-based plans. So once we have determined what type of a disaster we could have, we create objectives to be able to respond to those and best take care of our public and get past it and be on the road to recovery sooner. It helps to guide our grant deliverables and how we develop our grant objectives and funding as well. By making these identifications of our risks and assessments, we can identify and close gaps over time with the funding that we get from the federal government and the state government. So the word POETI is something that we use a lot. We use a lot of acronyms in our line of work: planning, organization, equipment, training, and exercises. So once we've identified all of these things, we start to do the planning. We do the organization, training and exercises. We purchase equipment that might be helpful. For example, you heard about levee breaks and things like that. As a result of the 1997 levee break and flooding that we have done millions of dollars worth of improvements in our levee system. We have made purchases for supplies that can help in the event of a levee break or a perceived break or boils or whatever happens to those levees. We've purchased, so far we have 7 containers that will care for 100 feet of levee break, immediately ready and in place in places that we know are kind of potential areas where we are concerned about levees, or we know that there have been breaks in the past. We also have purchased, many of our local maintaining agencies are currently in the process of obtaining several more of those containers. By the time we're finished in June, we'll have 26 different containers spread throughout the Delta to help with those 1 mile long break areas in case of those type of emergencies. We've been providing stashes of sandbags and equipment and things like that in various other places. We're developing a logistics space in the north part of the county to store equipment for quick response. So that helps us to be able to help the locals in being prepared. And it also gives us a little bit of time for the state response to assist us if we are ultimately going to need the state. It gives us the ability to try to take care of that early on before it gets out of hand. So this kind of brings me to this is the main theory or topic of what I want to talk about. The more people in our community that are prepared for a disaster, the fewer people that our first responders will need to help. So how can you and your family plan to be prepared for some sort of an emergency or disaster? The first part is to get informed, understand what those hazards are, and understand what's going on around you. Understand how we share information, how we get out emergency information, and how that happens. Make a plan. Consider all different hazards, just like we do. Consider what you'll do in the event of everything, and communicate that with your family. How will you let people know you're okay? How will they get to you, especially people that are not even in our state? You know, when it was Georgia and Tennessee and all those Midwest states that were just recently involved in that horrible tornado last month. If you had loved ones that lived in that area, you immediately thought of them when you saw that, and you wanted to reach out to them to see if they were okay. But all of the communication lines were wiped out in some of those areas. How would you get to them? Have you thought about, you know, what will they do? Who will they call to say, yeah, we're good, we're okay, or we lost our home, but we're okay and we're in a shelter? How would you get that information quickly? So think about that sort of thing. If there was a flood, what evacuation route would you take? Is there only one way in, one way out of your neighborhood? What would you do? What if you needed a shelter in place for that chemical spill, like I spoke about earlier at the Port of Stockton, for example? What would you put in your disaster or your go kit? And lastly, how would you get involved? So we spoke a little bit about hazards in San Joaquin County. Another quick list here: disease outbreak, tornado. We have had tornadoes in San Joaquin County, though they've been relatively minor. They usually strike out in the Delta region where there's not a lot of impact in those locations. I think we've lost a couple of sheds. We don't have a big influx of earthquakes here, but there is always something that can be different. You know, in our business, we never say something can't happen, because it always brings me back to the Japanese earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown that happened all within a matter of 3 days. So no event is too big, and some of these can overlap. So fire, utility outage, you know, we had the public safety power outages there for a while. We've been told that our county is probably not going to experience those moving forward because the utility companies have made significant changes to their grid and how they do that. But there's always a chance that there could be some sort of an issue or an explosion at a location, and we could be without power for a long period of time. Heat wave is one that we can look forward to many more of due to climate change, I believe. And then flooding, of course. So how will you be impacted whenever a disaster occurs? This cartoon always comes back to me. Oh, here's the real estate agent. Oh, another nice feature that's in this house is located in a valley with a nice stream running through your property. What happens when the rains come? How does that stream impact that little house? So notice there's a boat on the roof. They're prepared. Maybe you might not want to buy that house. So, you know, put some of the potential impacts in a disaster: loss or damage to your home, loss of revenue, not able to go to work or school. No power means no ATMs are working. There's shopping is limited. Gas stations are out of service. Banking is closed. The power outages up in the foothills right now. Some of those locations have been without power for 10 days now. They're not able to just run down and get more gas for their generator or run over to the bank and get some cash because banks are closed. They're not able to operate. Grocery stores are not able to do point of sale purchases because they're just, you know, even though they have stuff on the shelves, they may not be able to sell it to you. So there's a lot of other little things that come with this. So disasters impact us in a lot of different ways, even if the disaster itself is not really big. So make a plan. So plan to survive on your own for at least 72 hours. Know what your evacuation route is, and I'll give you some web pages that will help you in planning for that in just a couple of moments. Create a personal support network. Plan for services to be unavailable. Identify your family contact. This is what I was talking about a little bit ago. My family, I have family all across the country, but one person has been assigned in the South and one in the North. So if a disaster happens in our area, I call or text or somehow get a message to one of those two people. And I say, we're okay. That's my job. So everybody else across the country knows, oh, we need to call this person to see if she's okay. Because that way there's no more phone lines, no more people trying to call into an impacted area only to get a busy signal or only to get, you know, that the line is not in service. So now they know who to reach out to. So I've made that arrangement with my immediate family that I will call them and let them know, or I will send a text. Do you know that in a disaster, picking up the phone is probably not the best of ideas, but if you send a text messages go into a queue and they sit there until they find a gap to be able to send that message. So the text message may be delayed, but that's one of your best ways to get information out to family and friends, because those will sit in a queue until they can finally get out. So that is a good way to do it. There's also the American Red Cross has their application of I'm okay. So keep that in mind and look into how you can use those services. Inventory your home possessions. This helps with your recovery for your getting funding back from your insurance company to replace things that you've lost. And then, of course, copying important documents. Put things in a safe deposit box in a bank. Put them on the cloud where you can access them. Make sure you've password protected that document, but you can at least access it whenever you need it. Because when you work with FEMA, getting reimbursed for losses or getting some sort of funding or assistance, those documents will be very helpful in completing the necessary paperwork, because all government likes paperwork, so keep that in mind. So have written instructions for how to care for a service animal. in case you are ill or they have to be separated from you for some reason. Prepare a disaster kit. Keep assistive devices readily available in case you have to speak into a translation box or you need other assistive care. Keep that by your side in case of a disaster, in case you have to evacuate. Let's see. This goes into people that have special needs, mental health, cognitive languages. Make sure that you have information pre-printed to help them get help in case you are not available to help them. All right, so what's the difference between a stationary and a portable disaster kit? So your disaster kit should be accessible. So wherever you store this, it should be in your home or someplace like that. So this is just a list of some of the things that will be helpful to have in that kit available in case of some sort of a power outage or disaster. Water for everyone in the household for at least 72 hours. And it's about 1 gallon a day is what they recommend. Non-perishable foods, games, personal documents, a hand crank radio for information, flashlight or flameless candles, extra batteries, medication. I always tell people on the medication piece, because medication expires, and if it's just in our emergency kit, we need to make sure that it's current. So if your physician will allow you to order a month in advance of when it's expired, take that last amount, put it in there and keep it. So that way you have about 7 days. And every time you get new medication, exchange that from your new medication. So you constantly have it rotating and you don't have to worry about it going bad. A change of clothes, an emergency whistle, hand sanitizer, plastic sheeting for sheltering, and of course, cash. That's going to help you because you won't be able to use those ATMs like we talked about. So your Go kit, this is one that you might want to keep in your vehicle or someplace that you can grab and go if you're evacuated. Those folks in some of those wildfire prone places, this would be helpful for them because when you hear that there's a disaster coming, you don't have a lot of time to think about it. You have to grab and go. So this at least gets you started. So here's a few ideas and things, and I'll show you our webpage where you'll be able to get lists and other important information to help you fill out this Go kit. So it's better to have these and not need them than to need them and not have them. So I wanted to kind of give you an idea of some of the emergency power backups that are out there. You know, these power generators, they're small. They're only about this big, the two on the left there. They work to power a CPAP. Maybe you have some medical equipment that you might need, a small refrigerator or fans when it's really hot out and lose the power that can turn on, at least circulate the air for you. They can power your phone. You can take them camping. They're great. And you can invest in those anywhere from 125 up to about 500 for a pretty high end, high powered one. The two there in the center, they're great for your phone. So that way your phone battery goes dead. Now you have a way to at least charge it once, or with those solar power ones, you can have a continuous charge. And lastly, the emergency generator, have to have gas or propane or natural gas. Those sometimes they have dual. Those run anywhere from $3,000 to $2,000 or $3,000, depending on how big of one. I personally have one to run my refrigerator just in case, so I don't have a lot of spoilage. The bigger generators are needed for refrigerators. A landline. A lot of us, now that we use a cell phone, we might not think about this, but if you have a home landline, look for a phone that doesn't require power. If you have to plug it into electric, it's probably not going to work when the power goes off. But something like this one on the top here, that one will work. So think about that for landline use, because usually the telephone line won't go down as quickly as the power light.
Shelley, I think we need to wind down and go to questions.
Okay, I'm almost done. I'll hurry through this and get to the last part. Let's see. I wanted some of the more important pieces. We do have our office sends out the emergency alert system messages and the National Weather Service messages. These radio stations are good places to get emergency alert information. And also our sjready.org. This is the best website that I would encourage you to have on your favorites so you can get to it quickly. Anytime there's an emergency activation of our emergency system, a message will go through. We will have a pop-up on this page that will give the same information. So if you missed it or you needed some clarification, extra information will be here. You can go here to get planning information, COVID testing, vaccination, flood, and any other kinds of emergencies. So this is our county's one-stop place, and we keep this updated every single day of the week. Some of those other web pages will help you with any other questions that you might have. And as always, feel free to reach out to anyone in my office for pointers or information to help you. SJ Ready also has links to flood maps that we have been developing over the last several years for evacuation, and they will give you an idea of how much water you can expect to get in your neighborhood if a levee or a dam were to break, and which evacuation routes you should take. So we've been working on creating smaller maps like that that will help you. And if you have questions, please feel free to reach out to my office. And that was the end. I did it.
Thank you so much. This was great. Can you stop your screen share at this point?
Sure.
And I'm gonna try mine. Go back to mine. Let's see. As we've been listening in, attendees have been able to submit questions per the chat. And at this time, Jane Wagner-Tyack will ask the questions, and our speakers will have an opportunity to respond. We will get to as many questions as possible. We may go a little over, so if people need to leave, they can leave. And other questions, if they've been submitted, can be answered. We'll figure that out per email. Okay, I'm going to stop my screen share, and we're going to be open to everyone. So Jane, if you could bring up the questions.
Right. Well, I'm just going to start at the beginning, and we really do have a lot of very good questions and not very much time. One possibility, I think, is that I've saved the chat, and we can get these questions answered outside this particular meeting and make that information available to the people who've been attending as a backup. The first question is, I think, for Pat. The timeline for expected future disasters always seems to be shortening. Can some of these effects be reversed?
That's a good question. On some of these, we just don't know. It's very difficult for local people to have much of an effect on things like coal-based power plants. There are other things that we can do that can make a big difference, at least locally. And that would include things like better regulations for some things. Overall, I think we are going to have to switch to renewable energy sources, and as completely as possible. For us, that may not be as hard as it is for some areas, because we have already all of this air power coming from the wind turbines up in the Altamont Pass. We also have some hydroelectric power, although that will be affected by the loss of our snowpack. But that's not the only thing we're doing. We have a whole program going in the county now to help people put solar panels on their houses. I'm looking into that for my house now that I finally got a new roof. There are things we can do as far as conservation. There are things we can do with things like water, wastewater in particular. There is now a power plant attached to what's going on down in San Diego. They have a pilot sewage treatment plant that produces drinkable water. People don't want to drink it because they know exactly where it's been and what was in it before. So it's being used to recharge the aquifers in San Diego. And once it's passed through 8 or 10 feet of rock, people are perfectly willing to drink it. We can look at things like that and make a big difference for ourselves. And then work on the national level if we're going to press the government to step in on a bunch of these others. It isn't going to be easy on that level because there's a whole lot of money involved. Some of these other things will save money. I think we saved, $260,000 a year, maybe more, just by the city of Stockton switching its street lights to LED lights. That kind of thing we can do all over the place.
Okay, thank you. This is a question for Shelley, and it kind of answered it, but you might explain again. Describe how families can connect even without phones.
A lot of the connection capabilities that we have now are internet based. Sometimes the internet goes down and we don't have access to it. Cell phones have the ability to call 911. Those get put into a queue oftentimes. We can, like I said, sending the text message. Those are some of the only ways right now that are available. Once you get to a shelter, and we know that you're safe, many shelters are implementing the capability to have standalone Wi-Fi capabilities, so that way they can send out messages for people to make sure that their loved ones know that they're safe and too. So getting to a shelter is probably one of your first steps whenever you're faced with a problem like that and you can't reach out. Sometimes it might take 24 hours or so, but and I did talk a little bit about some of the other capabilities. So hopefully that helps. If I think of anything else, I'll send you an email, Margot or someone, and give you some more pointers or handouts.
Thank you.
Sure.
What is the plan? This is probably a question for Shelley. What is the plan to notify bogs-trapped residents if there's a release of hazardous materials stored and distributed at the Port of Stockton?
Yeah, I didn't get to go into too much on that piece. I ran out of time there towards the end, but I do want to make sure that people understand. I live in Boggs Tract, by the way, so I very much aware of what goes on here for sure. Once that message gets put out, our office is among the first to be notified during any kind of a hazardous materials release or incident. The city of Stockton is also has the capability of sending out emergency alerts and messages. They'll send them out through their Nixle system. The Office of Emergency Services has overriding wireless emergency alerts that will go out on your telephone. We also have the ability to send out other email, telephone calls, reverse 911 calls. And the Port of Stockton, for those that live in the vicinity, has a signal of siren that goes off during something like that. So it would alert you to maybe go to check your emergency information, to turn on the TV, to turn on the radio, to get information. So that is a relatively fast process where they get that information to us right away. And we work with the city of Stockton and the port very closely.
Thank you. Another question for Shelley. Does San Joaquin County have sufficient heating and cooling centers? How do field workers get information about extreme weather and where to go?
Extreme weather information, we share that on SJ Ready as well. It also, we put out news bulletins. We have Facebook, Instagram, Nextdoor, and I missed Twitter. I don't use it very much, but I know that we use that as well. And we share that information through those avenues. Heating and cooling centers are typically in areas of higher population. So those are mostly run by our cities. All of the cities have heating and cooling centers or cooling zones as well, just places where you can go to at least cool down and get water. Those facilities are generally opened Some of them are open 24 hours a day or on a set schedule during the day because they're like senior centers and community centers. San Joaquin County has 6 or 7 community centers that we operate, and we open them based on a threshold, how many days it's been hot, how hot the temperature is overnight, and what the need is. We also work with RTD. They'll do free transportation to those centers whenever they're open. We share that information through those social media accounts.
Great, thank you. Patricia, instead of drought, might we see too much frigid temperature in California depending on the El Nino, La Nina events?
I'm quite sure we will. What we're talking about is climate extremes. The average is going up, but it's the extremes that are going to cause us the big problems. We will get more cold snaps, just like they just had in Seattle. And the reason I'm still here in Oregon is because we had this sudden outburst of snow. Eugene never used to get snow more than once every 10 to 12 years. Now any winter it can happen. Stockton has had problems before with temperatures dropping down to 21 degrees, and suddenly we have pipes bursting all over the place. So I would consider preparing your house for that as well. If you haven't wrapped your pipes, that's one thing to start with. For another, think about your insulation. It will help you with both the heat and the cold. And you must pay attention to the weather reports. So far, we've had a lot of effort put into letting people know when these things are going to happen because, you know, this is an agricultural county. We don't want to freeze the orange trees. We don't want to freeze a lot of our other produce, and we certainly don't want to freeze ourselves.
Okay, thank you. Shelley, are there plans for the EOC to hold community education or information classes on emergency preparedness?
There are none right now. That's a great idea, though. I like that. Some of our cities have community emergency response teams, which are just everyday citizens that want to get involved. And they do have a lot of those kind of classes and opportunities. And ultimately what happens, people that are part of that group are invited to help maybe go door to door and share information with the public on a Saturday or help us if we need to get the word out for something. So if we were going to have this emergency where there is a freezing and it gets really cold, we have a cold snap, then a team like that would be asked to help go door to door and see if there's any seniors that might not have been given information, or might be cold and need to be contacted and done a welfare check on, or take them to a shelter or things like that. So we do have what we call a CERT team, Community Emergency Response Team, and they're being set up all over the county. We have one in Tracy, Manteca, Lodi. North County is actually in the process of developing one. And again, that information can be found on our SJ Ready page or by calling our office directly.
Okay, thank you. Are there plans to have emergency shelters fitted with air filters that are protective when air quality exceeds harmful levels?
There are grants in place that allow those shelters to make those kind of recommendations. I know that currently we're in the process of fitting some of our shelters with emergency generators. So that way at least they can have emergency power if power goes off. So that is something that is on the radar that we're looking into. At this point, it has not been done. Whenever we do have those wildfires around us, we are getting really bad influx of smoke. Those are all things that we look at to how we can help. But right now, most of our shelters have been relatively small. There are very few people that are using them. So we're using our money in the best places where we can.
Okay. In case of flood, are there plans to evacuate nursing homes?
Our Office of Emergencies, Office of, the office I came from, Emergency Services emergency medical services, that's it. Our emergency medical services agency here in San Joaquin County is the primary point of contact for all things medical and health. That office has worked very closely with our skilled nursing facilities, our long-term care facilities, hospitals, clinics, surgical clinics, dialysis, and all of those things medical. And they are all required to have comprehensive evacuation plans in place and how that works. And they work very closely with the Emergency Medical Services Agency to be prepared in the event of a disaster where they have to evacuate. And we work very closely with the state as well on that. So we actually have comprehensive plans in place to provide transportation. RTD is a very good partner with us to help get folks out of those homes if we need to in case of excessive cold or heat. I know in my previous role, we've evacuated at least 5 or 6 of those facilities. I helped with the Napa fires in Roseville, the Roseville fires, helped evacuate the VA Medical Center there several years ago. So that's something that is huge in our planning, and we've also exercised that many.
Thank you. And there's a comment here from Christine Faree, says maybe she missed it on the list, but people need to add a point to check on neighbors, elderly or special needs neighbors during an emergency. And she said that lots of calls to the sheriff's office in Amador County during the last power outage were to check on family members. And she suggested that that may not be the best use of resources.
That's very true. And usually whenever we put out our information during a heat wave, that's one of the prime comments that we make is if you have a neighbor nearby, check on them, make sure they're okay. In 2006, Stanislaus County had some deaths as a result of a heat wave, and it was because the community didn't check on their neighbors. So we do ask that. We also, this might be helpful to know, we have lists that anytime during a heat wave, and we know that there's some vulnerable people out there, we have lists that are provided by Medicare to us of people that are on emergency medical support. So if they lose their power or they have any kind of things that maybe oxygen or things like that, we're given their address and point of contact information. So that way we are able to reach out to them. And that's where we use some of our other county employees as disaster service workers to help make those contacts. We're able to put it on a map, set up a plan where they can go out and make physical contact with those folks in case of that emergency. So that is one of our plans that we implement in case of that type of an emergency.
Thank you. I have a question that's not on the chat about flood zoning based on 100, 200, 500 year floods. Would either one of you like to comment on that? That's what our flood insurance is based on. Do you think that those zones are realistic in this county?
I think they need some updating. We are already being told that some of the recent events, like this huge snowstorm that enveloped the Pacific Northwest, is a 1,000-year event. Well, clearly it's not. I would like to see those time periods reframed. I think they're confusing. And I think they don't tell people what they really need to know. I would also like, just for a second, to back up Shelley on that question about cell phones. She is quite right about the text messaging. I went to a DARPA conference one time. That's the Defense Advanced Research Projects Administration, where they wanted science fiction writers to come in and pitch ideas, and it turned out they were already doing 90% of what we thought of. But they also had a speaker there who was involved in the relief effort after the Christmas tsunami in Indonesia. And he was talking about how difficult it was to communicate when you had the land-based phone systems out. Then you had ships from various navies. You had military personnel. You had the Red Cross out there, and nobody's phone systems communicated. The only thing that got through was text messages. So bear that in mind. And I would also want to add a suggestion that anyone who can take some first aid training. some CPR training. If you are the first responder, it'll help you deal with things and you may be able to save somebody. Nobody can plan ahead for that except by just taking the training, being ready.
Thank you.
I'll also touch on that as well very quickly. FEMA is in the process of updating the 100, 200-year flood, 500-year flood information for our area. Keep in mind, you know, they say it like that. It is very confusing. A 500-year flood is a 1% chance, and that's all it is chances. Nobody knows when the next flood is going to happen. They can map out all of these scenarios and things, but we really don't know. And that's why I really like to pound in the part about being prepared and knowing where you're going to go if your area is flooded. And if you're in a flood zone or if you're in an area where a dam could go. I mean, in San Joaquin County, the Calaveras Dam, I believe it's called, up in North County, all of a sudden it's escaping me. Northeast County there, Calaveras River Lake. If that dam goes, something happens, our entire county will be underwater. Downtown Stockton will have 22 feet of water, 36 hours. Are you ready to get out of the neighborhood for that? I mean, we saw how the Oroville Dam, when that happened, how hard it was for people to get out of the neighborhood. So those are things that we need to think about and be prepared for and have those go back.
Thank you. We have one more question here. Is climate change being taught on a regular basis in any of our school systems?
I think we'll have to figure that out. We might look into that and have it as answered at our next event in the series. I don't know. Good question. My tech person has asked me to wrap up because we are a little over time. And I want to thank everybody for spending their Saturday morning with us this morning. I especially want to thank the tech support we've had here. We have done some tech things with Zoom that we have not done before. So this was pretty exciting. So Jane Wagner-Tyack and Bill Loico, with some help from Walt Whitman, were extremely helpful and made this go as smoothly as it possibly could at this point in time. I'd also like to thank the committee that's been putting this together, who has been meeting vigilantly every 2 weeks for the last several months up to the holidays. And that's B. Lingenfelder, Daphne Shaw, Kathy Schick, Mary Kanifik, Patricia Voss, and Jane Wagner-Tyack was always there supportively. And thank you so very much. Hope to see you all at the next event, and we don't have the date yet or the things like that lined up. We expect it in March, so stay tuned. Okay, thank you very much. I'm gonna leave the meeting now. Enjoy the rest of Saturday.
Thank you.